So I figured it was a good time to just go through the negotiation process to end the Russo-Ukraine war. And we're going to not just be looking at where we are now, but what's happened up to now, and what is likely to happen in the future, just the different parties, how are they thinking about it, what are their goals, and just trying to give you kind of an overview. Because I find with a lot of this stuff, you hear like the day-by-day snippets, and there's a lot of lore. There's a lot of lore to get caught up on, so let's just see if we can bring some sort of reason and order to this. Okay, so the story so far with regards to the negotiations. Now, regardless of whether you think they are being sincere or not, Russia has consistently stated that it is open to discussions to resolve the crisis prior to the special military operation. And I'm not going to go through all of them because there's so many different things, but they've had agreements, Minsk, Istanbul, although that was after the special military operation started. There was the agreement in 2014 to hold new elections. If you just go back, there's been all kinds of different negotiations. And up until the start of the special military operation, Russia has always maintained that they're willing to have negotiations. Through the entirety of the last 3 years, Russia has always had the position that we are open to negotiations. Now, this is kind of something that frustrates me, and we'll talk about this a bit more later, is the leadership in the media in the collective West don't listen to what the Russians say. That is, Putin can give a speech, Lavrov can give a speech, the Russian government can issue a policy document, and the leadership and media of the collective West will not read it. So the phenomenon we've been having for the last 3 years is Russia said, yeah, we're open to negotiation. And then the media goes, Putin is not ready to negotiate. He doesn't want to end this war peacefully. And so this has kind of been going back and forth. So my charitable explanation of this, beyond them being like too lazy to look at the Kremlin's official website, is that negotiation is being used in what I call a non-standard way, which means unconditional surrender. So the negotiations, as the Ukrainians view them, and we'll get to that a bit later, is Russia just completely withdraws from Ukraine. A bunch of other stuff happens, and then they can negotiate after the war has been resolved. So I think that's what they mean, is Putin is would negotiate like some things in Russia's favor. So negotiation, I think, is code for unconditional surrender. So like I said, the West largely ignores whatever Russia says. They consider Russia to be a party with no agency. And I've seen this time and time again. I think recently they discovered that Russia has been talking about denazification. And they're like, where did that come from? Why was this never mentioned before? And I mean, Russia's been talking about this for years. They've been talking about this at the start of the special military operation. I think that was what Putin announced, was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. Now, you can think that this is legitimate or not, but this is something that the Russians have consistently said is one of their main objectives. And like recently, they're just acting like they just noticed it for the first time. And when we look at like the Kellogg proposal and stuff like that, they just ignore that. Like it's just anything about Russian speakers, anything about forced Ukrainization, anything about that is just completely absent. It really does seem to me like they just don't listen. They don't, like the analysts or whoever don't read the public statements that Putin and Lavrov make. I don't know if that's because they view them as being fake, like that it's just bluster, it's just bluffing, that Putin will just say anything, that he's just a pathological liar. But by and large, with a few exceptions, they will just ignore whatever it is Russia says. And what winds up happening, and this is true for a lot of things, is the collective West will just negotiate with itself. The various factions within the State Department will negotiate a treaty. They'll negotiate it with the Europeans and Canada and Japan and whoever else wants to get involved with it. And then they'll come up with a treaty, and then this will be the treaty to end the war. They think that Russia will just accept the treaty. And I don't think that this is really me straw manning the argument or being unfair, because that's, once again, that seems to be what it is you will have just different parts of the State Department talk to each other. You'll have the Europeans talk to each other, and they'll come up with a plan and then they'll give it to Russia and said, this is the plan to end the war, and Russia will have no input on it. There was a number of peace conferences throughout this war that Russia was banned from. So it was just basically the Europeans and Ukrainians coming up with how humiliating the peace treaty will be for Russia, and they are not included in the process. And I don't know if it's just, we'll get into possible reasons why this is in just a moment, but that seems to be where we're going. And just as someone who covers this, it's very frustrating to see like politicians and media people say things that are demonstrably false. Like you can, once again, you can argue that Putin is not acting in good faith, that his arguments are nonsense, but they won't even reference them. And I mean, imagine if the situation was reversed and the Russians didn't read any statements of Trump. They didn't watch any speeches. They didn't watch any interviews with Marco Rubio. They just ignored all of that. People would think that that was pretty stupid, and I think it's stupid in this case. So Russia has zero trust that any agreement it makes will be honored. I'm not going to go through all of this. This is another thing. Putin and Lavrov, if you look at them funny, will go into like a 20-minute speech about broken promises, all this stuff that we thought we agreed to but didn't wind up happening. No one will address any of this. It's just completely ignored. There's no debate about it. They won't even try to respond to what the Russians are saying. The only response I heard was that the negotiations, I forget if it was immediately prior to the war or near the start of the special military operation, were done just to buy time. And I believe that Macron and Merkel have admitted to that it was just thrown out there as a way to buy time, and they never were serious about it. So Russia just thinks that none of this is going to be violated, is going to be honored. We had the energy ceasefire recently where they were going to restrict attacks on certain types of civilian infrastructure to do with energy. And as far from what I've seen, the Russians largely kept to this. The Ukrainians did not. There's all kinds of attacks on energy plants and oil wells, like oil storage and all kinds of energy things. I think there was like several thousand cases that the Russians documented of Ukrainian violations, and they gave that to the Americans. And I don't think there was any actual response to it. When it came to like trying to come up with a ceasefire, like I remember Russia came up with some very reasonable questions, like who's going to enforce it? Like, what do we mean by ceasefire? And they're just like, we need more details. And people just said that the Russians were, I think, like basically mentally ill for wanting details as to what a ceasefire would actually entail. But even if Putin does trust Trump, which I think he has a certain degree of trust in him, Trump is going to be gone in a couple of years. He's an old man. He might not even make it through his term. And maybe J.D. Vance will succeed him, and maybe J.D. Vance will keep the treaty going, but maybe Kamala will become the next president, or Pete Buttigieg, or God forbid AOC will become the next president of the United States, and this will just get thrown out. They aren't going to get a formal treaty. They don't have the votes in the Senate, so it's just going to be some like handshake agreement or whatever. It's not going to have any real legal weight behind it. So what is the reason for all of this? So I think, and this is me being charitable and assuming it's not just bigotry against Russians or a sense of superiority or arrogance or something like that. We're gonna try to steelman this, and that is I think they believe what the Ukrainian army tells them. So the Ukrainian army will just give fantastical casualty figures. Like they will say, for instance, Russia is using 20 times the amount of artillery per day, but they're taking twice as many casualties as we are, which doesn't seem physically possible. And that is kind of how the narrative is they will just say, like in battles, oh, it was a 3 or 4 to 1 kill ratio. Zelensky has said like only 40,000 Ukrainians have died and like 1 million Russians have died. That's not even like an exaggeration. That's pretty much what it is. The American estimates are somewhat higher, but I still think they're extremely low. So they will just take whatever it is that the Ukrainian army or Ukrainian intelligence tells them. They will not verify it and they'll just print it. And the media will also just say stuff like Russia's economy is on the verge of collapse. They won't go and like look at the World Bank or the World Economic Forum or the UN or any of these like organizations that actually do the research and look at the books. They will not look at any of the actual data. They will just report that Russia's economy is in tatters and that the war is in a stalemate and that Russia's losing, they might even say. There's no real reporting or attempt to look at the actual situation, and that the political elites 100% believe this, and no one in the intelligence community will tell them otherwise. So they assume that Russia is on the verge of economic and political collapse, and they can basically just do whatever they want, and the Russians will take whatever offer they have to get out of it. So that is my charitable explanation of this. If you hear a lot of frustration in my voice, it's not even really like a pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine thing. It's an intellectual honesty thing, and intellectual dishonesty really irritates me. And I feel like a lot of the collective West leadership and media class and intelligentsia are just extremely dishonest in the way they just ignore sources. They ignore things that the Russians say. They just take, like, once again, how can Russia be using like 10 times as much artillery but be taking like 4 times as many casualties? It just doesn't make sense. Like during the spring offensive, the Ukrainians claimed that Russia was taking like 3 or 4 times as many casualties despite them attacking into highly fortified areas, and the Western media will just run with it. So yeah, it's frustration on that. It's not necessarily a frustration on the sides in the war. I just really hate intellectual dishonesty. So this brings us to the question, what about Trump? I think fundamentally Trump is very disinterested in this whole war. He views this as Biden's problem, as he likes to say, this wouldn't have happened if I was president. He doesn't want to own this war. He thinks it's a massive waste of time and money. He's more concerned about Iran. He's more concerned about Yemen. He's more concerned about domestic issues. Even if everything goes right and this war gets resolved in his favor, it's really not going to do anything for him and for his administration. I think what Trump thought is, I'm going to come in, I'm going to treat Putin like a real human being. I'm going to listen to his concerns. I'm going to try to give him a deal that's something other than unconditional surrender. And then Putin will accept that, and then the war will be over, and I'll win the Nobel Peace Prize, and everything will be great. I do think that Trump vastly underestimated how complicated this thing was, and now that it's actually turning out to be complicated, I feel like he's rapidly losing interest in it. And there's been a lot of speculation, and he said this, that if they don't resolve it in the next, I mean, the timeline keeps changing. Like, it was first, we're going to resolve this the day that I come into office within 24 hours. Then it was a week. Then it was 100 days. And now he's like, well, if it's not resolved, then if the two sides don't agree to this deal in the next week, then I'm just going to walk away from it. And we just have all these statements that are just kind of thrown out there. So Trump's at least giving the impression that if the Ukrainians and Russians don't play ball, he's just going to give up, leave, and they're just going to have to deal with it, and the Europeans are going to have to deal with it. I do think that there is a certain degree of narcissism here with Trump, where there's this whole like narrative that he's the greatest deal maker in human history. I don't know if we really have that much evidence of it, but he had a book ghostwritten called The Art of the Deal. So that means that he's like the most skilled international diplomat of the era. So I think he just thought like, okay, I'm going to talk to Putin like a businessman. I'm going to flatter him, and Putin's just going to do what I tell him to do because Biden was such a tool and Blinken was such a dick. And by contrast, things are going to work out. And I mean, that has happened to a certain extent. Like, relations have gotten a lot better. Putin said very nice things about Trump. They seem to be making progress on reestablishing diplomatic relations and stuff like that. But I think it's just Trump just thought that that would happen. I also think that he just thought America is the best country in the world. America is the strongest country in the world. If we tell Russia to do something, they're going to do it. The thing now, he's like, oh, well, Russia wants to do business with America. So if we offer Russia doing business with America, they'll just accept that and they'll just go along with it. Once again, I don't think he really cares that much about this. I don't think he is very well informed about it. And he just kind of believes whatever it is people put in front of him. And most of the people around him tend to put forth the mainstream narrative. Vance and Tulsi are outliers with regards to this, but by and large, most of the people around him have a similar take to the mainstream media. Some of them are a little bit more pragmatic and they're willing to throw Russia a couple bones to get it resolved, but it's just kind of a shade of what the mainstream narrative is. There's a lot of division within his own cabinet. You have Kellogg and I think Rubio and maybe Walz, who are on the side of neocon light, and they want to try to give Russia as little as possible and try to force Russia to accept whatever this deal is that they came up with. Whereas I think Tulsi and Vance are more, and Witkoff are more in the camp of let's just give Putin what he wants and leave, because Putin's winning this war. If we hold out longer, it's just going to get worse. So these are, I think, the options that Trump has in at his disposal in kind of somewhat descending order from most to least likely. So option one, and I think this is probably the most likely to happen. He presents the Kellogg plan, which we'll get into a minute, as a reasonable compromise. We know basically Russia is 100% going to reject it. They've already said they're going to reject it. And Ukraine will probably reject it too. I think if they do that, he'll say he tried. He'll say both of you guys just don't want peace. I tried to offer you the greatest deal in the history of deals, and you said no, so I'm just going to walk away. I tried. If you guys don't want to cooperate with me, then that's that. I think that the Kellogg plan offers enough concessions to Russia, at least like rhetorically, that Trump will be perceived as trying to make a compromise, and he can at least go to his base and members of the Republican Party who probably are pro-Ukraine but don't want to go against Trump, and this gives them an out. The mineral deal I also think was part of this because it was like the worst deal in the history of deals, and I think you could argue that Trump never expected Ukraine to accept it and he didn't want them to accept it. And that was part of this whole poisoning the well, trying to get it so that he could walk away without looking too bad. That is number one. Number two, Steve Witkoff, to my understanding, is largely of the opinion, and I think Vance and Tulsi are also in this camp, of just giving Putin what he wants. This whole thing is a massive waste of time and money. It's not really accomplishing anything. Even if it works, it's not going to help out America's strategic interests. What Putin wants is tough, but it's not unreasonable. Just accept it. Tell the Europeans they can do whatever they want. If they want to accept it or not, it's their problem, and then leave. Three, there is re-engaging with the war. This would be bringing back more sanctions, giving Ukraine more money and weapons, and just going back to what Biden was doing, in the hopes that something will change, that Putin will cave, that the sanctions will finally work, that the Russians will grow tired of the war, that something unspecified will happen to turn things around. And I do think it would be embarrassing, but he probably does have the votes in Congress. He would have to rely on the Democrats, though, to pass an aid package to Ukraine. I think the only way I can really see this happening is if Trump just gets really angry that people rejected his amazing deal, and he's just like, okay, well, fine. I'm just going to go back to doing it because Putin wouldn't accept. I thought Putin was my friend. I made him the greatest deal of all time. He didn't accept my deal. So I'm going to go and just try to sink this whole thing. And then there's the final option, which I don't think he's going to do, and just threaten Putin that he's going to intervene directly unless he accepts the Kellogg plan. I'm just putting that as an option. I don't think he's going to do that, but this is Trump we're talking about, so who knows? Okay, so we talked a bit about the different actors, at least with regards to Russia and the U.S. We'll talk about Ukraine a bit more on the next slide, but I just wanted to give some context as to what these peace agreements actually are, because it gets thrown out there. So I've attempted to come up with this as best as I can from what I can remember, what people have said. Take this with a grain of salt, just because different people have different interpretations of this. This is to the best of my knowledge. This is a mixture of what was said and me reading between the lines as to what was meant by ambiguous language. Okay, so this was the offer, the Istanbul deal. This was basically what Russia was asking for near the start of the special military operation. In terms of territory, Crimea is basically de facto Russian. Ukraine does not have to recognize it at the moment. At some point in the future, though, in the next 10 to 15 years, they will have a discussion about it and work something out. Donbass would actually not be independent. It would become an autonomous part of Ukraine, probably with Russian influence, maybe with Russian peacekeepers, but it would remain a nominal part of the Ukrainian state. So there was actually theoretically no territorial concessions. Russia asked for Ukraine to carry out denazification. To me, I would interpret this as disarming and banning the ultranationalist groups. That include protections in the Ukrainian constitution for ethnic Russians, for their culture, give their language official status, protections for the Russian Orthodox Church, prevent discrimination in hiring, stuff like that. Just basically protections for the ethnic Russian population. That Ukraine would pledge to never join NATO, but they were actually open to Ukraine joining the EU. So they said, well, Ukraine can maybe join the EU so long as they never join NATO and they remain neutral. Ukraine would have to have a limited military, so that it would not be strong enough to threaten Russia. They had a rough agreement on this. Russia was willing to kind of pick a starting number and then finalize the details later. And there was going to be a joint security guarantee, the idea being that America, the European countries, and Russia would collectively guarantee Ukraine's neutrality. There would be no foreign bases in Ukraine, foreign military bases in Ukraine. It was worded in such a way, though, that basically Russia had veto over any troop deployments. I think, though, it would also apply to Russian troop deployments. So that was the initial deal, which I think was actually a pretty good deal. I think most of that was pretty reasonable. Maybe you could say the disarmament is bad, but I don't know. Just throwing that out there. So the current proposal that we have on the table was Putin gave it in a speech to the Foreign Ministry in June 2024. And this is what he said: this is my absolute minimum. So Crimea and the four regions, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk, will be fully ceded, including the parts of the region that Ukraine still occupies, and they will be legally acknowledged as part of Russia. Ukraine will acknowledge that they have ceded the territories and that they are legally part of Russia. There will be the same denazification and disarmament of ultranationalist groups. However, there has to be regime change, whether that takes the form of an election, whether that takes the form of purges of ultranationalists in the government. There has to be some form of regime change in Ukraine. Now they're saying no NATO or your EU membership ever. The Ukrainian army will be limited. The limit will probably be significantly lower. And the only security guarantee is from Russia. There is nothing from the various European powers. They are not viewed as being trustworthy. So this is the change. Obviously, the treaty has gotten a lot harsher. So why this video was made was because I wanted to make this this chart because I think it looks cool. So these are the comparisons. So we have Zelensky / Europe, Trump / Kellogg, and Russia. So this is where they differ on the various things. So I just thought that this was interesting to lay this all out here. So flexibility of the position. So Ukraine will pretend to be flexible. I don't think they are. I think they have very hard demands as to what they will actually accept. I think, though, if they're talking to Trump or they're talking to the Europeans or whoever, they will pretend that they are willing to accept things that they won't because they know the Russians will never accept it. So it's a way of continuing the grift. Trump's entire thing is chaotic. There's massive internal divisions. Russia has stated repeatedly this is their minimum demands. There's no compromise. If this is not accepted in the near future and they win a conventional military victory, the terms are going to be a lot harsher. So the attitude towards negotiations. The Ukrainian attitude is there is a decree that legally prevents any negotiation with Russia. This is something that Putin has pointed out many times. To my knowledge, the Western ruling class has never actually addressed it. That even if, like, Ukraine legally could not agree to have negotiations unless this was repealed, that is ignored. And they said they will have negotiations once Russia withdraws entirely. Putin is removed from power and put on trial for war crimes and reparations are paid. Then we can have negotiations. I don't really know what it would be at this point in time. Russia and Trump are just willing to open to negotiations. Now, as for a ceasefire, so the Trump position is they want an immediate ceasefire. That is, everybody just stops where it is. The conflict is immediately frozen. Ukraine's perspective on this will depend on who they're talking to. Sometimes they'll say, yeah, immediate ceasefire. That's a good idea. Sometimes they'll say, okay, no ceasefire until Russia withdraws. And it will just very much kind of go back and forth, like I said, depending on who they're talking to. I think that if they were to support a ceasefire, it would just be so they could rearm and re-prepare and refortify and get ready for the next round. I don't think there's any actual desire for a real ceasefire there. There's not really a pro-peace faction of the Ukrainian government. Russia has said there will be a ceasefire once an agreement addressing the root causes of the conflict has been agreed upon. So the NATO-EU membership, you may see here that because the initial American position was a lot more like the Zelensky / European position. The Kellogg position was an attempt at a compromise. I still think it's much closer to Zelensky Europe than to Russia's, but it definitely is a movement from where Zelensky and Ukraine are. Okay, so European soldiers, Zelensky and Europe have said that they want immediate deployment of whatever it is, the coalition of the willing, the assurance force, whoever, to Ukraine. That just has to happen immediately. America has said, okay, there can be a deployment of European forces to Ukraine. There can be military bases there. There can be whatever. But we'll wait till the treaty is signed. Russia says, no, there will never be foreign troops in Ukraine ever. That's just not going to happen. And once again, this is a non-negotiable. Zelensky and the Europeans are adamant that they have to have basically immediate deployment. We've had Stammer and Macron saying, even if the U.S. doesn't approve it, we're going to go in with our troops and fight Russia or whatever. NATO-EU membership. Ukraine's position is that it should be allowed to join NATO immediately and join the EU and have full NATO protections. Trump has made this vague promise that, okay, Ukraine will never join NATO. First, Kellogg was like, okay, well, we'll say that Ukraine won't join NATO for the next 10 to 20 years. Now they're saying never, but there's not going to be any legally binding aspect to it. It's just going to be like a gentleman's handshake agreement. Um, and we're theoretically agreeing with you, but we're not. I don't know if the Kellogg agreement says anything about the EU. Russia has said we need a legally binding guarantee with an enforcement mechanism, whatever that means. Maybe that Russia would legally be allowed to invade Ukraine should they ever attempt to join NATO. So territory. Ukraine has wants the 1991 borders. The borders as they existed prior to 2014, just entirely intact. Every square inch of territory has to be taken back. Depending on when you talk to them and who asks them, they sometimes say, well, maybe we could accept temporary occupation, maybe not. As with a lot of things the Ukrainians say, I think their actual position is every square inch of territory or nothing. But they will say that they're willing to accept something or other if they're talking to the Americans to try to keep the aid flowing. The Trump-Kellogg plan will formally recognize Crimea as a legal part of Russia, and they will accept indefinite holding of Russia's indefinite occupation of Russia's current holdings. So they will kind of de facto, but not de jure, recognize the territories they've occupied. Europe and the rest of NATO, though, does not have to agree to this. And basically, it's freezing the conflict. The Russians have said Crimea and all four regions, their full administrative borders, have to be legally recognized as part of Russia. Okay, the status of the Russian government. The Ukrainians have said that there has to be regime change in Russia, including war crimes trials and reparations. And the breakup of Russia into constituent republics has also been discussed. They said we will not negotiate with Putin. There has to be dramatic regime change. Trump doesn't think that's possible or desirable, and it's just LARP, so he's not interested in it. And obviously, Russia is not interested in regime change in their own country. The status of the Ukrainian government, Zelensky wants to keep things going, presumably with state of emergency in effect and all the restrictions on the press, religious institutions, rival political parties. Trump wants there to be elections as soon as possible. A lot of even like the neocons want there to be elections in Ukraine. And I think they would also like it if Ukraine would lessen some of the more police state authoritarian measures. Russia wants regime change. I don't know if at this point they would accept just elections or if they demand a pro-Russian government be installed. But it would also have to be widespread purges of the ultra-nationalist groups. The military of the Ukraine wants no limits to the size of their military, and they can receive as much Western aid as they want. America agrees with that. No limits to Ukrainian military. They can keep rearming Ukraine as much as they want. Russia has said that the army has to be limited, so it's no longer a threat to Russia, and there can be no further military aid from the West. And then finally, Russian minority rights. Ukraine has said there will be no rights for Russians beyond whatever exists now. Ukrainianization of the Russian majority areas or minority areas will continue. I've heard things from some of the ultra-nationalists that if we're losing the war anyways, we should try to improve the demographic situation. America doesn't listen to Russia when they say this. To the best of my knowledge, they just believe Ukraine. They're like, look, Russia's claiming all this stuff is going on. Is this stuff going on? And Zelensky will be like, no. And then the US will go, we believe you without investigating. So there's nothing wrong. And so the Russians have said from the beginning, protection of the Russian language, Russian Orthodox Church, culture, autonomy for some areas, probably like Odessa, and an end to a forced Ukrainianization. So as we can see here, we have three very different proposals. Trump tried to come up with something of a compromise, and to be fair, it has moved quite a bit from where it was a year or two ago. A year or two ago, they were fully on board with the Zelensky plan. They've moved a bit more towards Russia, but I think they don't understand that this is hard. Russia will not compromise on any of these, and they have said this is our minimum demands. I think Trump still thinks that these are the maximalist demands and that Russia will accept something a lot less. And I think Ukraine's just out to lunch. I don't think they'll accept anything less than their Zelensky formula. As I've said, I don't think there's really a pro-peace faction in the Ukrainian government. There's the pro-war faction, the dissident pro-war faction, and the ultranationalists, and none of them really want a peace agreement. At best, they might pretend to agree to one with the intention of restarting it as soon as they get rearmed. I don't think, though, there is any real desire to end the war among the Ukrainian political class, even if there is among the Ukrainian population. They're benefiting too much from it in a material sense, and they can maybe keep the whole grift going. Maybe they can have a government in exile and get even more aid money. They can base it in, I don't know, Florida or Paris or something like that. There's really no incentive for the Ukrainian ruling class to try to come to a peace agreement, because that might lead to elections and it might lead to them being removed from power. So I think that the Ukrainian and Russian positions are pretty much 100%. Ukraine might temporarily put some of it off, but I don't think they will ever accept occupation of territory in the long term. They'll eventually try to retake it, or some shenanigans will happen. So that is the different positions. And I know that took a while, but I'm condensing 3 years worth of negotiations and policy papers into a relatively, I know it's going to be 40 minutes, but short for the whole thing of this. So what is the most likely outcome? Trump is going to have Witkoff go to Moscow. He's going to present the Kellogg plan. The Russians and Ukrainians will both reject the Kellogg plan because the Kellogg plan does not address their minimum needs. Then the fallout will depend on whether this was Trump's plan or not. If the plan was, we're going to present what seems like a reasonable compromise, both sides are going to reject it. We say we tried, and then we just leave it to the Europeans, and we can get out of this and still save face. And that would be the ideal time to get out. Russia's big offensive is coming. Ukraine might collapse soon. So we tried. Let's just go home. So that is part of it. Now, the other thing is Trump being Trump. He might feel that he's being slighted, that he came up with the greatest deal ever, that he thought Putin was his friend, that, why isn't Putin accepting this? This is an amazing deal. This is the greatest diplomatic deal in history. Why would you do me like this, Putin? And he gets angry, and then he tries to go back to the binary status quo of giving Ukraine money, weapons, and intelligence. So I think those are the two possibilities. I honestly don't know. Trump is very erratic. It can be kind of hard because sometimes he will just do, I don't know, it's difficult to predict with him. I still think the most likely outcome is probably some form of walking away, either slowly or quickly. He might just let the aid packages run out, keep providing Ukraine with diplomatic support and military intelligence, but otherwise just let it go. What Russia will do is they'll be they're in a bit of an awkward spot because once again, this is progress. This is significant progress from where we were 3 years ago. And Trump is trying to negotiate in what he thinks is good faith. And Putin doesn't want to screw this up because normalization of relations with America is desirable. It would be nice if they could cooperate again, if they could have some trade going. A lot of Russia's friends, like Brazil and India, do a lot of business with the US, and they would like this resolved. So I think what the Russians will probably do is Witkoff will go. Putin will say, you know what, man, I appreciate it. I appreciate that you're making the effort. There's a lot of things that we need to hammer out about this. This is a complex treaty. This is going to take a long time. So why don't we take some ideas from that and some of our ideas, and we'll put together like an expert group of really smart people, and they'll come up with all of the necessary details that are needed to resolve this war. And they will just basically try to run out the clock until they win a conventional military victory and can just impose whatever terms they want on Ukraine. So they're going to just basically, I think, play for time. And that's, I think, where we are at the moment. The most likely outcome, and the outcome I kind of hope happens, is that Trump presents this plan, it gets rejected, he gets angry, he just says, okay, well, no one wants peace except for me. They rejected the greatest deal in the history of deals. I'm just going to leave. Ukraine is no longer getting the military and economic support it needs to survive. Its military collapses, and we get an end to this war, albeit it's going to be on much harsher terms than what Russia is currently asking for. I personally think, regardless of how you feel about the conflict, what Putin is asking for is harsh, but it's not out of line of where they are in terms of where the war is at the moment and where Ukraine and Russia are in terms of where it's going to go. It's really not that much more than where Ukraine is. Their army is being demilitarized in the sense that it's being destroyed. A lot of those areas are already under Russian control or have just been destroyed by warfare. They're not going to join NATO. Joining NATO is just not going to happen. I think Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, and a couple other countries have said they will veto Ukrainian entry into NATO. So it's just not going to happen. Whether that's going to happen or we're going to have some drama where Trump gets irritated and feels slighted and he goes on like a rampage and tries to get Putin to agree to his terms or whatever, I don't know. But that I know that was long, but hopefully that explains the whole situation in some detail. Please like the video, subscribe, hit that little bell button, and do share these. If you know somebody who is interested in it, I threw in some of my commentary, but I try to do these at least somewhat factual and objective. And it is a lot more work to put this together. I think the quality is a lot better when I do this, but just support me if in the efforts to improve the quality of the content, as it were. So God bless everybody. Have a good week, and we'll talk to you guys again real soon.